So, good morning. My name is Jeff Brown. I am this year's chair of First Five Placer. I am also director of Placer County Health and Human Services. And it's my distinct pleasure to be with you this morning to participate in today's town hall. So before we get started, let me just cover two items. The first is photography is being taken. And if anyone's concerned about this, please see a staff member at the registration table following the program. The second is there will be a book signing opportunity with Robin Carr Morse immediately after the event in the lobby area. So if you're interested, please look for that in the lobby. So to begin, I'll mention that this event marks our third town hall focused on the importance of young children and their needs in Placer County. We're building upon the knowledge and the inspiration from Dr. Dal Myers, a demographer from USC, about the economic importance of children and the opportunities locally that we can do to improve access to health care, affordable housing, quality early learning, and career readiness. So today we bring the significance of adverse early experiences to the conversation. So we in the Health and Human Services arena work with children and work with adults on a daily basis who have experienced trauma. And we have done this for years without always acknowledging or understanding the role that it plays. And I have to say, in the last decade, we have come to realize that trauma and adverse childhood experiences have a significant impact and could be the most important controllable factor related to health, substance abuse, and mental health conditions. If we're truly going to make a difference and improve and sustain changes in the lives of the people that we serve, we need to develop both prevention and intervention strategies that acknowledge trauma and effectively address its impacts. So this morning, we're incredibly fortunate to have with us Robin Carr Morse to deliver a keynote presentation on her research insights from decades of experience as a therapist and professional in child welfare and social policy. After Robin's keynote, we will have a panel discussion with our local leaders to take us deeper into how the issue is impacting our local communities. So during the meeting today, you can share your thoughts and questions through technology, through the text messaging tool that we're using. And you can see some instructions that are here on the screen. They're also listed in your program. So everyone is encouraged to send questions or share ideas at any point in the program. Instructions for sending the messages you can see here. It's important to note that the keyword town hall is one word and must be messaged first to opt in. So we're trying to take into account your privacy, but this will ensure that your number is verified to be part of the dialogue for this event. After messaging town hall once, you don't need to do it again. You are all set. And you're welcome to submit as many questions as you would like this morning. However, only 3 questions will be allowed to be answered today in the Q&A session. But after this event, there will be an email and web page that addresses the questions that were not answered here. So to get us started this morning, we're going to begin with a short video on childhood adversity in Placer County that actually features some of our local leaders and panelists this morning.
When we see these health issues that impact the quality of life and length of life, a lot of them have their roots in early trauma. We have people who are struggling in our communities right next door, and we might not have the same awareness that other communities might have. There's this belief that everyone else is doing fine.
I've been in this business for over 20 years, and the level of violence that we've seen in the last 2 years is more severe than the first 18 years combined. Last year, for the first time we started having to turn people away, we turned away over 500 people. We frequently hear people say that their babies are too young to remember this domestic violence incident or really traumatic incident. Whether or not they can recall a very specific incident, it's changed the way that their brain has developed around how they deal with trauma, how they deal with fear, how they associate love with fear, and it can last a lifetime.
What science tends to show is that the need for security, the need for kids to feel safe, is even more important and even more compelling, an even deeper desire in those kids than the need for food and the need for water.
We need to stop thinking that trauma only happens over there. It happens to that other community. It happens to different families. Trauma can happen to anyone.
My vision for Placer County in addressing childhood trauma is to build off of our strengths. So to start with the fact that we do have a very strong educational system here. We do have strong healthcare providers. We collaborate well together. So use our strengths to overcome the disadvantage that still remains in our communities.
I believe we can solve this problem. We need to come up with new ideas and new ways to tackle this, and those have to be funded. We need people who are willing to step up and make policy changes, who are willing to write letters to their congressmen, to speak up when they see things in their communities, and to rise to this occasion to change this traumatic experience for the children in our community.
Raising healthy kids means supporting parents, and that's the work of people providing services. But it's also the responsibility of people in the community, and it's also requires an effort from policymakers. And if we all work together, then we'll be successful.
This morning we have with us Todd Leopold, Placer County's Chief Executive Officer. We're very fortunate to have him here. Todd was appointed as Placer County's Executive Officer in January 2018, just a little over a year ago. He has more than 20 years experience working in the public sector, with more than 17 years of experience in county government organizations in Colorado. Previously, Todd served as the county manager for Adams County, Colorado. He has been recognized many times with the National Association of Counties Innovation Award, multiple Alliance for Innovation Awards, and the Denver Regional Council of Governments Impact Award. Even more importantly, Todd is a champion of children and families and a great supporter of programs countywide that serve at-risk individuals. Please join me in welcoming Todd Leopold.
Well, good morning. I'm really fortunate to be up here and appreciate the opportunity. We're gathering this morning for this important issue about early childhood adversity, and hopeful that the discussions we have this morning are going to be fruitful, and the impact and result is really going to be a call to action to build community capacity and empathy, as well as to address and fully understand the wraparound services that this community provides in this county. Let's start the conversation today and keep these conversations moving forward. It's really important for our community partners. I look around the room this morning, we have elected officials, we have our school board members, school administrators, our law enforcement, professional counselors, parents, students, all of those that make this organization and this community successful. In addition, with our good friends and partners with Stand Up Placer and the Placer First Five Commission. I can tell you firsthand that this county is committed to working with and solving this issue. Particularly within our human services area, we are passionate about the need to protect our most vulnerable population, that of our youngest children. Trauma-informed care has become a growing topic of conversation over the last year, and research reveals that many children, especially the youngest, experience multiple traumatic events in their early lives. We know that children who are raised in abusive or stressful environments grow up to be adults with coping difficulties. We serve that population every day along with our school partners. Some struggle with homelessness, others with substance abuse or mental illness. Forms of physical, sexual abuse, and neglect and hunger are just some of the issues that are lingering in their lives as they grow older. I'd like to remind us that the first 5 years of a child's life are fundamentally important. They're critical to the foundation that shape a child's future, mental and emotional health, happiness, growth, development, as well as learning achievements in school. Feeling safe and secure in a family and community environment are critical. Research indicates that nearly 3/4 of children between the ages of 3 and 5 have experienced at least one traumatic event in their young life. So I look at you today and I say, what are we doing in Placer County? First Five Placer is a critical component and partner, providing both leadership funding and articulating 4 focus areas. One, primarily focus on the reduction of child abuse and neglect in this area. There are countywide cross-sector efforts, including comprehensive responses and resilience that includes active participation on the part of the county, county's health and human services and community partners, such as our Child Abuse Prevention Council. There are a host of other individual programs that seek to mitigate the effects of trauma and the capabilities of both parents and caregivers. A special note are a range of home visitation programs that offer a variety of services in the community, including psychological safety. This includes maternal, adolescent, and child health, home visits performed by public health nurses trained in adverse childhood experiences. Other programs include our Child Systems of Care Service, which we provide mental health services, kinship support, differential response, therapeutic behavioral services, and to name a few. And our core partnership with the Placer County Office of Education is critical. They provide an innovative family, friends, and neighbors care program to build the skills of those who look after our young children in our community. This program has been highlighted both at a statewide level as well as other funders, including the David and Lucy Packard Foundation, who believe all children should have access to health care and learning opportunities that help them be healthy, ready for school, and on track to reach their full potential. It's through programs like these that truly make a difference in our community and the quality of life a person may experience as they grow older. But as we know, it comes down to early intervention and attention to this effort. And I ask you to walk away from not to walk away from a child facing adversity. We as a community must act, and we must be a voice for the voiceless. As we age, the average person may forget just how a young child views their environment, how powerless they may feel at times, how dependent they are on their caregivers, whether those caregivers are loving and competent, or unfortunately, potentially abusive and neglectful. It is so vital that we keep our focus on our most precious and vulnerable children in this community. So today I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Robin Carr-Morris, who's a well-known author of Ghost in the Nursery and also the book Scared Sick. Dr. Carr-Morris is an expert on early childhood adversity and its impact on development. Robin has been a family therapist in private practice in Portland, Oregon for over 35 years. She has designed and directed programs that effectively focus on scaffolding vulnerable parents in the challenging task of building healthy children from the beginning of life. Those first 5 years which are so incredibly critical, and the years children are the most developmentally vulnerable. Robin will share her insights and experience with us this morning. I believe you'll find Robin's knowledge and exceptional value in the area of your work and personal contributions you are involved in to support this effort within this community. Please give Robin a warm welcome from Placer County, Dr. Robin Carr-Morris.
Good morning. I have to say, I'm newly arrived, but I am very impressed with Placer County. I had the privilege last night of going to dinner with a group of you and getting an idea not just of the services, but of the incredible job that Placer is doing of coordinating those services. It seems as though the people that, at least that I met last night, really care about each other and talk to each other about what's going on. So there's a real effort to pull those things together so that they work for people, real people with real jobs and little kids. And I'm impressed. You're doing a great job. It's wonderful to address a group of people whose mission is focused on nurturing and building young human beings from the beginning, especially now at a relatively dark time in our nation in understanding the critical nature of the importance of this information. I came to discuss the impact of trauma on earliest development, which is a subject, as Todd said, of both books that I have written, Ghosts from the Nursery and Scared Sick. Now, we ought to have, Dayton, we ought to have the slides up here now. So let's see if this works. There we go. We're transitioning now from Placer to kind of a general look at trauma and how it works. Ghosts, the first book that I wrote, traces the impact on the brain of often unrecognized trauma and neglect on the development of adolescent violence and adult violence, including the ongoing phenomenon of school shootings that you've all heard about across the nation. Scared Sick talks about the impact of early trauma in the shaping of adult health, physical health. Regardless of whether we're talking about behavioral or physical health, the common denominator is the human brain, how it's shaped by nature and by nurture. It all begins here with the brain, and the brain begins in the womb. During gestation, beginning as a fetus is first developing, brain cells in that little fetus originally form in an area called the ventricular region in the center of the fetal brain. To form the cortical brain, this is the part of the brain, come on. This is the part of the brain that we use for reason, for rational analysis and thinking, our so-called executive functions. A fair percentage of those brand new little neurons or brain cells have to travel from the center to the surface of the brain. The cortical brain is just under the skull. It's the last part of the brain to develop. To get there, they climb these long, skinny, rope-like cells called glial fibers. This slide shows new little brain cells, or neurons, little black dots, migrating along these stringy fibers. Each cell has a very precise destination, a very precise schedule. Picture 1 billion or more of those traveling through the fetal brain every day. As a cell climbs, it comes into contact with numerous other cells along its journey. This contact between cells activate genes in the cells that identify that cell's identity and its mission. When all goes well, the cells proceed to their destined positions. They perform their appointed tasks. But if anything interrupts or sidetracks this journey, the result may be disaster. Introduced at the wrong time, sometimes just a brief window early in the pregnancy, often before we even know that we're pregnant. Substances like alcohol, cocaine, nicotine, methamphetamine, prescribed and non-prescribed drugs, and very likely other environmental toxins that we have yet to identify, can alter the journey of the migrating brain cells. If cells are sidetracked and connect with cells that they weren't meant to, the fetal brain may be forever affected. These differences may not be visible when the baby's born. The baby may look perfectly normal. The difficulty may only become evident when the part of the brain that has been affected comes into play later in the child's development. These tiny synaptic connections, never meant to take place, can lie behind autism, epilepsy, and schizophrenia. This microscopic disorganization in cell migration is also implicated in the learning disabilities we all hear about currently, particularly ADHD, attention deficits, and hyperactivity, each of which, as you probably know, place children at increased risk of later conduct disorder, later in childhood. From the beginning, the ways that our brains are formed reflect not just our genetics, but also our experiences in interaction with each other. So regardless of what we'd like to think, the point to remember is that babies can arrive with widely varying experiences in the womb that may render them already traumatized and definitely more vulnerable to trauma in future occasions, right from the beginning of their lives. The second point we need to consider is that the human brain gradually builds from the most primitive brain structures and functions gradually to the most complex structures and functions as the baby matures. Brain development begins with a brainstem. The brainstem controls just the most basic parts of the body. It controls respiration and blood pressure, respiration, temperature, and so forth. Then next is the midbrain. The midbrain controls things like appetite and sleep. Let's see if we can get that on there. There's the midbrain, appetite and sleep. Then comes the limbic brain. The limbic brain is the seat of emotion and impulse. And then finally, the cortical brain is the very last part of the brain to develop. This is the part of the brain that's just under the skull at the top of the brain. This is where, again, our so-called executive functions take place. Complex cortical skills, such as self-control and connecting what we do today with what's going to happen a week from Friday, are later maturing skills. So they are still coming online through adolescence, which is why so many kids have so much problem with these issues. As the brain grows, the higher areas of the brain, especially the cortex, will begin to modulate and control the lower parts of the brain, especially the limbic brain. The younger the child, the more dominant are the more primitive parts, so that as the higher parts of the brain develop, so does the child's ability to moderate or control impulsive or more primitive behaviors. What this means for a child is that any experience during critical brain development that reduces the developing brain's cortical capacities, like chronic emotional neglect or exposure to alcohol in the womb, each of which take a huge toll. Wait, this is going ahead of itself. Come back. Anyway. Or any experience that increases the overproduction of the fight or flight responses in the lower brain, the limbic brain, such as exposure to abuse or domestic violence or any form of trauma, either the understimulation of the cortex or the overstimulation of the lower brain, can help set the stage for physical or mental health issues later in the life of a child. The third thing you need to remember is that the brain is the only part of the body that's particularly dependent upon use for optimal growth. It requires stimulation from the child's environment to complete itself. Each sound, each sight, each touch, each smell, there we go, literally build gray matter in the newly forming brain. When adequate stimulation doesn't take place for a baby, as in the case of chronic neglect, or when these experiences are abnormal, as when a child is exposed to chronic negative emotion chemically, that little brain reflects these realities not just psychologically, but physically. Trauma during this time is really different for little kids, for babies particularly, than it is for adults or older children. As adults, we may think of trauma as something dramatic, like a big accident or 9/11 or an act of nature. But we each have a mature or relatively mature nervous system, one that was, by contrast to that of infants, is a system with a history that was insulated by our interactions, positive ones, with caregivers who've already enabled us to calm and self-control those strong negative emotions. But for infants, new raw system. Come on. For infants, brand new little nervous system it's still uninsulated. So trauma can result not just from a single overwhelming experience like child abuse or the death of a parent, but also from an accumulation of a myriad little traumas that are often overlooked. They can collect and cumulatively overstimulate, overwhelm the child's ability to cope. Examples of this include gestating in a highly stressed mommy, prenatal alcohol consumption. We're having some trouble with this clicker here. Not sure why. Prenatal alcohol consumption, prematurity, or chronic early pain. For preemies, chronic pain in the NICU is very common. They experience an average of 15 painful episodes every day, which is fine if they're going home with someone who really loves and offsets that environment in the long run. But it can be very difficult if that child goes home with a young mom who is mentally ill or drug abusing or impoverished and leaving the baby with multiple people. Unnecessary use of inductions and cesarean sections are a form of birth trauma for many, many babies. And again, they can pass very easily. One of my babies was I have 4, and one of mine was induced. And of course, he came home to a totally loving environment, and we can offset that. But it is really tough for that little brain, that little being, to be forced into the world with chemical processes. Maternal depression, this was the one that surprised me the most. There we go. Remember Brooke Shields? Do you remember this story? She went through tremendous postpartum depression and tried her hardest. She was criticized by several other stars at the time. Maternal depression, because it interferes with the mother's ability to attune and attach to her baby, it actually has an impact on little brains no less devastating than child abuse and neglect. Why, you might ask? Because the baby's tiny system is totally dependent for emotional regulation on the attunement and attachment of the caregiver. When her nervous system, or his nervous system, the primary caregiver of the baby, is overcome and is dysregulated by depression, it creates the same dampening and the same dysregulation in her baby. Another one that happens way too often is early separation for whoever is the primary attachment figure, be it by death, hospitalization, foster care, adoption, desertion, or prolonged absence. Any break in the close envelope of love and connection in a baby, with a baby and a caregiver, can cause trauma. It causes a reduction of connections in the brain at the single most opportune time for their development. Another common source of trauma is inadequate, insensitive, or unpredictable child care. We spent a lot of time, Placer County and I, when we were having dinner last night, talking about how difficult child care is to obtain anywhere in the U.S. It's simply the exception and not the rule in most communities. We want very much to see that change as soon as possible. Women are in the workforce, and we need truly competent and well-paid people, emotionally competent people, not just degreed, but people who really lead with their heart and can do that exquisitely important attunement with a baby for an alternative caregiver. Another obvious little trauma is domestic violence. If a mother or father, come on, there we go. If a mother or father is fighting with a partner, of course this is toxic to a baby. That little HPA is constantly revving up and more vulnerable to any subsequent form of stress in the future. That just sets a baby up for hypervigilance. If babies witness violence, this is full-on trauma. This clicker leaves a little bit to be desired, Dayton. There we go. There's mommy and daddy fighting right over the crib. Another little trauma that can play into this with an infant is inappropriate divorce and custody arrangements. The primary concern in too many courts is being fair to the adults in the equation. Mommy wants her time, daddy wants his time. The developmental realities around attachment, around breastfeeding and a secure base needs to be sensitively factored in to parenting plans in courts. I've talked to a lot of groups of judges, and this becomes extremely important for them to understand the developmental realities that we all are beginning to understand around the developing brain. When trauma shapes earliest life, a time that we have not yet learned language to record our thoughts, the experience registers not in conscious memory, not in the language-based experiential memory, conscious verbal memory. Rather, it registers as a somatic or feeling memory, which is registered in procedural or unconscious memory in the lower brain. Stored as a sensation, there are no words attached here. It can be very difficult to access those memories, those experiences in traditional therapy. I'm here to tell you that. And let alone in a doctor's office. We have physicians like Rob who are terribly aware of it, asking the right questions, creating the right atmosphere to really get to those memories can be very difficult. Most of us can wrap our minds around the concept of use it or lose it when it comes to body growth, the development of limbs and muscles. Come on. There we go. We saw this play out with Romanian orphans whose brain scans showed chronic neglect. We can understand that math or music skills or language can be lost if never stimulated. What we seem to have trouble understanding is that this can also apply to emotional skills that are essential to successful lives, like empathy. There is an incredibly important part of the cortical brain called the orbitofrontal cortical brain. Alan Shore has done a lot of research on this area. He says it's mostly developed in the first year, if not the first 6 months of life. It is the seat of empathy. It's right here between the eyes, obviously back behind the cranium. It's the seat of empathy, of emotional self-regulation, and it is getting that settled and getting that developed is the foundation for complex problem solving. This is crucially built very early in life between a caregiver and a baby. It's built by the minute daily interactions between a baby and a caregiver. It's built by the quality of touch, the responsiveness, the ability to adequately read the baby's needs and to respond to them, the quality of facial expressions. It is the stuff of arms and laps. Having never been built, or having been built only minimally within the parental or caregiving relationship, this incredibly important capacity can be lost to the larger world. None of us in this room would be surprised if we met a teenager who we knew as a child had never been exposed to piano lessons or violin lessons, and therefore emerged as a teenager who was unable to play the violin or piano. But we seem surprised when children emerge who are totally lacking in empathy or positive regard for other people. The fact is that growing numbers of children in our nation and across the world are spending their first experiences and years in emotionally empty environments. There is, by the way, a tendency for people to think of emotional neglect in the same category as physical neglect, as a byproduct of either poverty or of abusive circumstances. But emotional neglect is much broader than this. It's much more pervasive. Ignorance of emotional development permeates our culture and our world. In the U.S., I worked with Barry Brazelton for a number of years, and he always used to say, we're a nation of idiots about infancy. Really understanding what goes on there is something, once you've trained and understand it, you can't ever not see it. But there are so many people who don't see it. Last night at the table, we were talking about how often, you'll read an article in the paper about a breaking and entering or a violent situation that the police came to the house and removed someone. And there'll be this little throwaway line at the end of the article that says, and a baby was found unhurt in the back room. Not true, not true. But we don't get it. Emotional neglect typically results from non-intentional behavior. It can be the result of a catastrophic situation like war. It can be the result of parents' simple unavailability to children. It's often, as I mentioned earlier, about ignorance about children's emotional needs, chronic maternal depression, mental illness, parental maturity, or even too many disconnected early providers. I remember, I don't have a slide of it up here, but I remember when Britney Spears had a mental breakdown many years ago. She has 2 little boys, and at that time they were less than 1 and less than 2. And the picture on the cover of People magazine showed a policeman walking out of her house with these 2 little boys. And some famous New York psychiatrist was quoted as saying, well, the kids are young enough that they won't remember it. Not so. This really is a time and intimacy intensive investment, one that we tend to overlook in our culture. In a nutshell, recent increased knowledge in biology validates what many of us have known for a long time. What happens to us emotionally happens to us physically. Our bodies are affected. Positive emotions, love, gratitude, feelings of connection, attachment to people, a sense of achievement or accomplishment, these are healthy and healing experiences that help mitigate against disease. But the opposite is also true. Chronic negative emotionality, especially fear, but also chronic experiences of frustration, shame, rage, grief, can catalyze whatever genetic proclivities we have toward disease. For one of us, that may be heart disease. For another, cancer or diabetes or arthritis or fibromyalgia. Come on. Dayton, punch that thing. Punch the computer so we get a change. What I'd like you to leave with today is a very basic understanding of how trauma works in your body and in that of little developing bodies across the world, as well as what we could do to help prevent these outcomes. To clearly understand the emotion-disease equation, there are 2 pieces of emerging research in physiology that we need to know something about. One of these is new information from genetics. From genetics, there we go. Especially the role of epigenetics. The second is the impact on our bodies of what we commonly refer to as fight or flight, the overuse of the response in our brains called fight or flight, or the HPA axis. We're going to begin with genetics because this is where many of us do actually begin in a doctor's office with a diagnosis of, say, high blood pressure or high cholesterol or whatever, arthritis. And the doctor says, well, it's likely genetic because your dad or your grandfather or your mother or your grandmother had the same thing. As we look closer at many ailments, we realize that the reason so many have been viewed as genetics is because we respond and we learn our responses to stress and tension from our families, often before we enter school. Really, isn't most disease genetic? Aren't most diseases caused by genetics? Certainly many are, but some very surprising new findings in this field. Many of you will remember that the Human Genome Project was concluded 16 years ago in 2003. And in spite of high expectations that scientists had, it came up far short at the end of this study in solving many problems. Scientists anticipated a much greater outcome from this study, including prescribe very specific genetic types of medicine and so on. It didn't happen. The reason that solutions were far more elusive than expected is that scientists found that in our cells circulating around DNA are proteins that affect how those genes actually are expressed. So inside our cells, we have DNA. DNA contains the blueprints or codes for making proteins that are the building blocks of life. DNA is the what of the blueprint. But surrounding DNA are non-coding proteins that circulate around it. These proteins detect and respond to chemically communicated environmental influences. They regulate how DNA will be expressed, causing certain genes to be expressed while other genes are repressed, all in an effort to enable the organism to survive their environment. The sheer number of potential combinations of interactions between these proteins and the environment greatly complicate predictability based solely on DNA. These processes are called epigenetic, literally above the genome. They occur around DNA while not changing its basic structure. So inside our cells, we have DNA that remains stable. We inherit these dynamic chemical processes, however, that surround and communicate instructions to our genes, like microscopic satellites rapidly responding to their surroundings. These proteins react to a host of variables, including viral infections, hormones, aspects of diet, prescribed and non-prescribed drugs, byproducts of plastics, and other often unrecognized environmental toxins. Scientists believe that up to 70% of the contribution to a given disease can be epigenetic. Interestingly, not only our own experiences, but those of our parents or even our grandparents with any one of these variables can influence our genetic outcomes. Here's an example. This is a water flea. It doesn't itch and you can't see it. It's actually a microscopic crustacean. What's interesting about the water flea is that when you look at a group of them, all with identical DNA, you can see that some among them have a spiny helmet on their heads and protect predators from biting them. Why? Why do some of them have a spiny helmet while others don't? The answer is that if the mother flea had a bout with a predator, typically a bite on the head, her babies are born with helmets. If her life was not threatened, the babies are bareheaded. The experience of the mother is transferred epigenetically to the babies. The helmeted babies have been prepared to survive an epigenetically detected threat. Nature is full of examples like this. Another one is the snowshoe hare. The snowshoe hare, when there is an increase in the population of predators in the rabbit's environment, so that survival is dependent on high levels of vigilance to survive. The increase in maternal stress hormones in the female rabbits when she's pregnant causes both a decline in the birth rate and an increase in the reactivity of the nervous systems of the babies she produces. They're born hypersensitive and hypervigilant. Again, this is nature's design for survival of the species. Think of how this pertains to a human mommy with a predator in her environment. The second piece of physiology that is so key to understanding the trauma-disease connection is the effect of what we call fight or flight on the body. Come on. Specifically on the immune and the endocrine systems. We've known for a long time that stress can have a negative effect on health, but when toxic stress is experienced chronically, very early in our lives, the effect on our health can pave the way, actually, for chronic disease. Here's how this works. When we perceive a threat to our well-being, in this case, we're going to use an example of a snarling dog. Images, smells, sounds, any perception of threat coming through the senses immediately triggers the fight or flight response. Come on. Oh, boy. There we go. There's a threat. And what it does is it immediately triggers the fight or flight response with the amygdala. The amygdala there is shown in the brain. Let's see. There it is. That's the amygdala, that little red dot. This is the alarm center in the brain. The amygdala instantaneously sets off what is called the HPA axis, or fight or flight, by sending an emergency message to the hypothalamus. This is also in the brain. See, it's the little purple dot right there, the hypothalamus, H. So that hormones can be secreted that allow us to mount and defeat the threat. The hypothalamus now sends 2 simultaneous messages. Come on. There it is. 2 simultaneous messages that act to balance each other. Now, it's going to generate 2 hormones. One message goes from the hypothalamus directly to the center of the adrenal glands, the A. This is down here on the kidneys. They sit right above the kidneys, the adrenals. And the adrenals will produce the first of 2 very powerful chemicals, beginning with adrenaline, the hormone that causes systems in the body to be activated for what we call fight or flight. There we go. Simultaneously, a second message is sent to the P, the pituitary gland. This is here in the base of the brain. There it is. It's a little yellow dot there. Right there is the pituitary. The pituitary is a small endocrine gland that sits in the base of the skull. This gland will signal the outside layer of the adrenal glands to produce the chemical known as cortisol. It honestly is on there. And cortisol is responsible for gentling the same organs that are stimulated by adrenaline. It's known as the hormone of rest and digest. There it is. So now we have engaged the HPA axis. all by the simple perception of threat coming in through our eyes, through our ears, through our nose. Any of the senses can perceive a threat, and we immediately can start into fight or flight. The HPA axis is the connection between three vital health controlling systems: the brain, the immune, and the endocrine system. These two hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, are the messengers that allow these bodily systems to talk to each other. The two hormones are meant to counterbalance each other. One stimulates the organs. Adrenaline enables the body to mobilize internal systems to defeat the threat, and then once the threat has passed, cortisol will calm these same systems so that they return to a balanced state. This is a life-saving system as long as it's used as it was intended, as an acute response. So adrenaline, the mobilizing hormone, will increase heart rate, it will increase blood pressure, it will make us hypervigilant and stimulate the immune system, readying the body to defeat and defend itself against a potential wound. Cortisol, which is the demobilizing hormone, will gentle those same systems once the threat is passed, particularly the immune response. It needs to calm the immune response so that it doesn't go into overdrive and attack our own organs. The problem comes that when that response is triggered too often, these hormones can become dysregulated. They weaken the very organs that they were designed to protect. They set the stage for many diseases that we commonly consider to be genetic. The diseases caused by dysregulation of these two hormones. Let's go over here. There we go. Include hypertension, heart attack, arrhythmias and atrial fib, hardening of the arteries and stroke, ischemic heart disease, COPD, type 2 diabetes and high cholesterol, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, liver disease, inflammation, and autoimmune diseases like lupus and MS, depression, anxiety, and addiction. So these are pathologies that can be triggered by the overuse of fight or flight. What happens is that a life-giving system that is meant to be stimulated and perform quickly in an acute situation gets stimulated over and over and over again, and pretty soon it gets set on high and it doesn't go back to its original state, which is the beginning of disease for many of us. But there is, in fact, another phase to fight or flight, when we can neither fight or flee, so that adrenaline and cortisol acting together cannot accomplish the job. Terror in the face of helplessness, whether it's real or perceived, will trigger a third state known as freeze. If we are helpless, as an infant or a very young child typically is, neither fighting nor fleeing, wait a minute, that's the wrong slide. Come on. There's freeze. An infant is in a totally different position. We know that an infant can't fight or flee. This is when they go into freeze. Freeze state results from the total overwhelm of the brain due to failure of fight or flight, or the HPA axis, to adequately protect the organism. In trauma, all of the systems, all of the processes take place internally, as in extreme stress. But we have nowhere to go. We have no ability to flee or fight. All internal systems for action are mobilized, but we can't go forward. The energy summoned can't be released. Under such conditions, absolutely overwhelmed by terror, like an electrical appliance receiving too strong a surge, we simply switch off and freeze or disassociate. So now a different arm of our nervous system takes over, essentially preparing us for death. This is the parasympathetic system under the direction of the amazing vagus nerve. It will now reduce heart rate and blood pressure and release dopamine, which is Mother Nature's own calming and pain-killing agent. Increased levels of dopamine are numbing. We feel removed from reality, in shock. We are at once hyper-aroused and in a fog. Our thinking or cortical brains are hardly available to us, and we're often without words. In trauma or freeze state, both adrenaline that stimulates heart rate and cortisol, meant to slow the same processes, are operant at the same time, and they're stuck without release, creating the strangely cycling symptoms of trauma-related diseases. This unregulated back and forth cycle of the organs affected is the hallmark of trauma-related diseases. Diseases caused specifically by trauma include, but are not always, but they are included in diseases caused by trauma, are fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel, GERD, and mitral valve prolapse. Some of you may have had the experience of going to the doctor with fibromyalgia or IBS or something like that. The fact is that there are no discernible abnormalities. They often cannot be diagnosed by discernible abnormalities, organic abnormalities. Doctors may fail to identify them, and for a long time, fibromyalgia, for example, was thought to be a made-up thing by women. It isn't. It's a product of trauma. For many, this is a childhood pattern. It's held unrecognized and unworked until, as adults, it comes to our attention with physical symptoms of long-held trauma. So you can see that there is a very real need for trauma-informed practices, not just for behavioral health, not just for mental health, but for physical health care as well. It makes huge economic sense. It makes huge human sense. Together, all of these are affordable at all of the things that I'm going to talk about that we can do are affordable at a rate of about a quarter of what we're currently doing about this. We're currently remediating problems in rather late stages among adolescents and adults. There is so much we can do if we begin at the beginning. Programs and policies like universal home and nurse home visitation. Let's see where we are. Oh no, we don't want that one. No, these are the things we're spending money on. And not nearly enough, by the way. This is somehow out of order. Here we go. Solutions. Come on. There we go. There's Nurse-Family Partnership. Do you have a Nurse-Family Partnership program here? The data on that program is gold standard. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. And I mean, they do a wonderful job. Nurses do a wonderful job, but so does home visitation using paraprofessionals, where they come into the home when a baby is born and work with mom and dad to get that on the right track. And if there are discernible abnormalities, the home visitor can diagnose it. High quality child care is another big, huge investment that we can make. This is home visitation. This is a funny picture of Michelle Obama in a child care center. She went and volunteered for quite a while in a child care center, and really wonderful child care is not always easy to find. We had a long talk about that last night. Preventively oriented practices in mental health for all parents are examples that make a huge difference to our nation's health and economy. First Five is a huge part of changing this. I'm so impressed with what California has done, and specifically with what Placer County has done. When we first got First Five, when the tobacco tax money came through, I went through California with Bill Lockyer, and we talked in just about every county. And some of the counties were not quite getting it. And last night when I sat with Placer, I thought, oh my goodness, this is a group of people who genuinely get it across the aisle. This is a very uniting issue, not a divisive issue. So I was really impressed with the group of people that I met with and what they're doing with this money. Someday, I hope we live in a world where parent support is a normal part of the week for anybody expecting or raising a child of any age, where the latest on emotional as well as cognitive development is made available for all parents, regardless of class or background, not simply targeting failure, but for everybody, regardless of economic backgrounds. We have a model for this in Memphis called UP, UPP, Universal Parenting Place. This is in Memphis, and these are from Portland, but the Parenting Institute is mine in Portland, but Universal Parenting Place is a place that I helped start along with Vince Felitti from the A Study, and it's a really remarkable environment. While they're still struggling in the present political environment, it's an amazing effort to integrate the best of what we know about ACEs and to prevent and break the cycle of trauma. I would encourage you to look up UPP Memphis for the specifics. Just imagine that you're the mother of a newborn. Typically having a baby can be hard on even a couple that's happily married or declaring their intention to be together. A new baby presents certain kinds of issues for almost every couple and presents some behaviors that they don't come with instructions. Imagine that you're the parent of a kindergartner who's just been kicked out of kindergarten or preschool for biting, hitting, kicking other kids. Imagine that you're the parent of a 6th grade girl who has been doing quite well in grade school, and all of a sudden she's coming home and slamming the door and not talking to you. Or a high school student that's failing his grades, hanging out with the wrong kids and smoking a whole lot of weed but not doing much else. There should be a place that you could come as easily as you can get a workout or a haircut, where you can receive 45 minutes of counsel on an ongoing basis about how to proceed with these situations. It's not hard. It makes all the difference in the world. I heard people last night so supportive of each other and so supportive in the way they talked about working with their clients, Jeannie and others, Catherine. The kind of love that can be extended through this process can make all the difference in our young people. People should be able to come without stigma. It should be as normal, again, as a workout or as a haircut. It should be something that we all have available on our daily path and that we use easily and proudly. It should be fun. I mean, in Memphis, we incorporate the best of what we know about trauma, so there's a lot of movement. I hope you know that in therapy for trauma, there's lots of movement, lots of physical movements, lots of psychomotor activity. We have the best drummer, African drummer, in Memphis. We use their dramatic group, which in the group, when there are group activities, we act them out with a professional dramatic group, and it's very fun and very stimulating. People want to come. And, in spite of the fact that they're oftentimes single parents of several children, it's a huge incentive to come off and bring the kids and join with a group of other parents going through the same stuff. None of us can miss the fact that we are seeing trauma so clearly illustrated here. Where is this? We're seeing trauma at our southern border. These news photos have been taken in the last few months. Let's see if we can hear this. This is going to be a problem like the videotape that we had. This is a little boy that was returned. It's too bad you can't hear it. He is crying, and she's saying, "You're a baby, you're a baby." He wants nothing to do with them. He's been separated from them for 6 months. He doesn't know these parents, and the mother is absolutely, the mother and father are heartbroken. This is going on as we speak. None can miss this kind of trauma. This is a toddler reunited, supposedly, hopefully, after months of separation, terrified and unable to recognize his own parents. Do we really believe that this alteration will simply go away without consequences to us? This child's life has been affected. Daily news photos like this, come on, I'm going to show you a picture recently of children in Yemen. Photos like this require defenses that no one's born with, and which, if they become the norm, result in a world unfit for human life. We have to know that as our world is growing smaller and more interdependent, we can't continue to ignore the effects of trauma on the world to come. Building a safety net has never been more important than it is now. Trauma is simply a word to describe experiences that can undermine brain-based capacities that are at the core of being human in the most positive sense. The capacity for empathy, which is the basis for love, the ability to self-regulate strong emotions, strong negative emotions like fear and rage, the ability to care about and focus on complex problem solving. All of these are brain-based abilities, and they can be lost or never built when trauma shapes earliest development. As planet Earth heats up, as vital resources like water and air quality are reduced, as we compete and negotiate through environmental poisons for endurance, these brain-based capacities are essential to our survival. I recognize that those of you who are working in First Five and care about First Five are the voices of this message in Placer County. In California, I hope you lead the pack. You're doing a wonderful job. I really believe that your work is the most important work there is, and it's a privilege to be with you. Thank you very much. I understand that we're going to have a panel discussion with those wonderful people that I met last night and some others. So I would invite those people to the stage, and we're going to proceed with the next piece of this program. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with the panel portion of this session. Thank you for being here. Can we give Robin a hand for that wonderful presentation? Very well done. So thankful for her expertise and knowledge. I'm Nathan Herzog. I'm the Dean of the School of Education at William Jessup University, also the board chair of the Child Abuse Prevention Council for Placer County. Welcome to this session. We have some experts on a panel here. Thank you for being here. I think as an audience, it's really helpful for you to think, with the presentation that you just heard, what stood out to you? What stood out that really impacted you? And try to take note of that. And the same question for you guys here. Jenny, I think we'll start with you. What from the presentation really stood out to you this morning?
Thank you. I'm Jenny Davidson, Executive Director at Stand Up Placer, and I'm a member of the First Five Commission here for Placer County. And what stood out for me is that some things are passed down genetically and some things are passed down by experiences. And we see that all the time at with the families who we're helping, that the violence that they've experienced has been generational, and seeing that impact on the kids as they come into our services as well, and their ability to handle fear and trauma, and how to handle change and all the difficult things that are happening in their lives. So that kind of generational experience around trauma.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, I'm Catherine Goins, Assistant Superintendent for Early Childhood Education at Placer County Office of Education. And what stood out for me, besides the fact I should have paid more attention in biology class, was the babies, that we cannot separate out the babies from their families and the children from the families. And we often talk about children's services, but it is really children and family services. And that when we are working with families and caregivers, that we really have to think about that family. And what also stood out for me is that we know what to do. I mean, that was very evident to me, that we know what to do, that we know high quality child care. Placer has generally high quality care. There's just not enough of it. We have wonderful home visitors with Head Start and Early Head Start and through the county. So it stood out to me that we're on the right track.
Yeah, hi, Rob Oldham. I'm Placer County Health Officer with Placer County Health and Human Services. Lots of things stood out to me. Great presentation, and thank you, Robin, for coming. Besides the issues with the clicker, but what really stood out to me is just the huge prevalence of childhood trauma, and so we can talk about some of the challenges of that. But from a public health perspective, looking at how prevalent childhood trauma is across all of our communities, across demographics, and basically every pocket has it, but also that we have this challenge of uneven distribution. So from a public health perspective, that brings up unique challenges. The second thing, I really appreciated your talk about the limitations of genetics and really the influence of epigenetics. I remember my mind went back to a little bit of a traumatic experience about 20 years ago in medical school, when there was this really this idea that genetics was going to change the way we practice medicine, and the limitations of that largely because of childhood trauma. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Doug Blake with the Roseville Police Department, and what stood out to me in terms of the science behind the HPA axis, the ignition of the fight or flight response, that's something that's really come into the law enforcement circles and our understanding of the human response to facing life or death situations in the context of law enforcement. And it recalled to mind a scenario where, if we can imagine as adults walking into the forest and having that very vivid experience walking through a dark, damp place, and we hear a rustling in the bushes, and we look up and 20 feet from us is a bear. And immediately the amygdala kicks in, the HPA axis, and everything that happens in your body is right when you're in the forest, when you're facing a bear. Now imagine if you were a young child and the prospect of going home was and would be the prospect for you and I walking into the forest and facing that bear. But that's a daily, chronic ignition of that system. And the same prospect of getting food from your parent is the prospect of facing the bear, and going home with bad news from school is that same prospect. And now as law enforcement, we step into those situations, those very complex situations, and we have to be attuned to the evidence that presents itself, even in small ways, if we're really going to be cognizant of ways we can detect, we can prevent, and we can intervene. And in law enforcement, we are starting to see really a movement, especially over the last 10 years, where we're willing to dismantle that silo we've existed in and behaved in conventional ways, and start working in partnership with people to not only detect, to intervene, but to prevent those things as we see them as first responders.
Yeah, thanks. Some great tidbits of information from Rama. Thank you again for doing that. And hopefully you guys all got something from that presentation you can take with you. I'd like to move on. Also think, we all may have experiences with this topic, personal, professional, and we have some experts here that can share some real examples of that. I'd love to hear, Catherine, we'll start with you, to think about how have you experienced this issue in a real way?
So in the 15 years that I've worked in Placer County, I have seen, unfortunately, hundreds, and I mean hundreds of children in trauma all over the county, from Roseville up to Tahoe, Lincoln, Auburn, Rockland, you name it. And there are hundreds of childcare providers and preschool providers in Placer County. And whether it is Jenny Safe House or PC programs, it looks very similar. And that is, these children present very aggressive. They are bullies. They cannot survive really and connect with their peers. And you see teachers working so hard to try and connect with these children. And you see family advocates trying to work with them. And we have a child that we are working with in our state preschool right now who is 4 years old. And this child comes into class every day and she hits, she headbutts, she scratches the faces of her peers. And you can imagine how the other parents in the program feel about this, right? And so this week, actually, the mother of a child who was scratched said, I want to talk to the mother. Well, this 4-year-old child's mother is on drugs and is homeless. Sometimes we can find her, sometimes we can't. And this child has spent most of her 4 years homeless from one coast to the other. She's with a grandmother in temporary housing, and she's trying her best. This child has clearly experienced trauma. She's not getting invited on play dates. She's not getting invited to the parties. And because she's not emotionally ready, when she starts kindergarten in the fall, she is not going to be school ready. And this, unfortunately, for the kids in trauma, is what any child care provider who's been doing it for any amount of time or anyone in preschool can tell you we see every day and all too often.
We see the same thing. Just last year alone, we served almost 450 children, and our numbers are doubling year over year of how many families we're helping, how many children need services. And when we get these kids in, a lot of times the parent has been protecting them from the abuse by really physically surrounding them, carrying them all the time, and keeping them away from the abuser. But then we have children who aren't meeting any of their physical milestones, who are, emotionally devastated by this constant trauma, who've actually been in the arms of a parent while the other parent is beating them. And these kids come in and they're difficult. They're not your easy, rosy cheeked kids that you want to play with. And it's really hard for us to even get volunteers who are willing to help with childcare, because it's not the cool thing that we do, I want to go on that next thing, and those are interesting, but helping with these kids is the thing that's really going to change what the next generation looks like. And it's hard to get people who really want to sustain that, because they're difficult to work with, but the end product is amazing. So we were talking last night about a little boy that came in, and his mother had constantly carried him. He couldn't be on the floor, he couldn't be in the crib because his father would hit him. And so he was a year and a half, didn't have any of his milestones reached, couldn't crawl yet, couldn't walk. And within the 90 days he was in our safe house, he was toddling around and kind of running a little bit. Went into our housing program, and a couple of years in our housing program, he was playing with every other kid. He had been so surrounded with attention and affection and support that he was now able to meet. He met all those milestones. He was in the normal development stage, but it takes that super intensive early treatment and affection and to be able to intervene in that family, and the respect for the mom who was willing to bring that problem to us, and also respect for the father who needs some services as well. And we have such good community partnerships around here to work with kids who have these issues.
Yeah, I'll just speak to my experience. One is kind of in the helping professions. In addition to working in public health administration, I'm a psychiatrist. One of my areas of focus has been working with women who are pregnant and postpartum, and with the families. And also, as a father of 4, I'm single parenting this week, and it's just really hard to be a parent, even for For those of us who, we have, living in Placer County with a great education system and lots of resources that, versus other communities that I've lived in. And we have 2 doctors and we have financial means, and it's just hard being a parent, especially if you have a child with special needs, et cetera. And so that's my, we talked a little bit about the empathy and even having community empathy, but just I think if we can all resonate with, many of us, if not most of us, had childhood trauma, but also for those of us who are parents kind of experiencing how tough that is for us, but then looking to maybe other families that don't have all the resources. And here in Placer County, I think that's because of some of our, because many people are well off, sometimes it makes it harder for those families who are struggling to voice that they need help.
Yeah, in law enforcement, I think one of the most regular things we face is the kind of violence that exists in homes with when we respond to domestic violence calls. And in many, in fact, probably most of those cases, that is not the first time that that kind of violence or that level of violence is being brought to the surface. And so it's tough, speaking from a personal standpoint, the times when I've gone into those situations, state law mandates we make an arrest. We really, if there's any crime that discretion has been stripped away, it's that. So then we are now faced with being the agents of one of the effective adverse childhood experiences by arresting a parent and taking them out of the home. And institutionally, that was where our responsibilities would end, other than maybe making some notifications. And I'm happy to say that we're really educating officers and seeing a movement in law enforcement towards not just stopping there, but reaching out and understanding the impact of just the simple fact we've gone into a home and arrested a parent and walked them out. Even when, the example you gave where a child was in a back room and was unharmed, well, our perspective now is that they're never unharmed, even if they're hearing the elevated voices, the screaming, yelling, and experiencing the violence even from just hearing it. We're now in touch with people, and we can start taking more active steps toward repairing and doing some things on the back end other than just being that agent of the effective damage that happens inside those homes.
I have a question for Catherine and maybe for all of you, but is there a therapeutic preschool here?
There is a therapeutic preschool in Sacramento County that collaborates with Placer County, but we do not have a therapeutic preschool within the Placer County limits. And so one of the things is that for the children who do not qualify for special education services, but they also can't fit into an environment, because those of us who are trained in early education are not experts in therapy. For Jenny's program, a crime has to be committed. And so there's this gap for the children who don't qualify for the special education services that PCOE and our districts provide and do an excellent job. But then we don't quite have a place for those children who've experienced trauma.
That needs development. That's pretty critical. How about early Head Start?
Early Head Start and Head Start are phenomenal. They've been in this community for decades. They have a home visiting program. They work with our low income. However, where's Gail? I think my boss is still here. She's been going to Washington, D.C. and advocating that, especially with the increase in minimum wage, very few people actually qualify for Head Start now. And so it's federal poverty level. 94% of the children on the waiting list for subsidized care do not qualify for Head Start or Early Head Start. So while it's an excellent program, we're limited who can access that program.
So we're going to go on to our third question. And I want to make a point, just a reminder that we want to interact with you. And so please text your questions as they come up. You have the information on the screen here. So please be involved with that. We'd appreciate that. Moving on to, it's challenging. Raising healthy children is challenging. It's not easy. This is an issue that's difficult, and there are barriers. There are challenges that we face that exist, and you guys have experienced these. Can you help us understand what are those barriers that exist, and then we'll get to some call to action about that. But what have you guys seen? So, Rob?
Yeah, and I started to talk about that already. One of the big challenges is just the prevalence of child trauma across our communities, right? And from a public health perspective, I mean, we see the burden of disease, and Robin kind of spoke to that. And so it's a big problem. I know some of the solutions are complex, and it's kind of an all hands on deck approach. There's no single solution other than, let's support families, and there's lots of facets to that. But just from a public health problem, it's extremely childhood trauma. It's very prevalent across the work with Vince Felitti and others, and Kaiser in San Diego was in a relatively affluent middle class, and the rates of childhood trauma were extremely high. Our Surgeon General, new California Surgeon General, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, which is a great leader, and excited to see what she's going to do. One of the things that she wants to do is start doing screening in all the medical settings across for childhood trauma, which I think is a great idea. But we already know what they're going to find is very prevalent in all of our communities, but especially there are pockets where we have much higher rates of child trauma. And one of the challenges, how do we communicate around that? Because there's enormous stigma, stigma associated with mental health and substance use disorders, but also stigma I mentioned about saying, yeah, we need help. It's stressful. It's tough being a parent, especially with children with special needs or with a single parent family. And so how do we communicate that of both saying this is really prevalent and many of our families face some of these challenges, but at the same time, there are pockets where they need extra support.
Exactly, and I would just add that funding, Robin and I earlier were talking about the funding. Twyla, where's Twyla out there counting? We're talking about funding streams that dictate what you can do with particular dollars. We do not have enough funding for mental health. We do not have enough funding for a therapeutic preschool. Even some of our clients who need legal. Jenny and I were talking last night. If you have physical custody, but not legal custody, there are many bureaucratic hoops that you have to jump through in order to access services to be able to get the reimbursement. And while I have to give a shout out to Kids First and Lincoln Lighthouse and Tahoe Family Resource Center, who have been a lifeline for our families in terms of counseling and support, but there is just not enough, they don't have enough resources to serve all the families who are experiencing trauma. So I would say funding for those services is a particular barrier.
I don't want to pick on Rob, but I think that one of the major barriers in every community is the fact that pediatricians are a natural place to catch a lot of this, but they don't have counselors or emotionally totally capable people in their office, and doctors often don't know how to ask those questions. It's really hard to ask about ACEs, especially a white middle-class mother, to ask about the prevalence of domestic violence or whether or not she's using alcohol or drugs, about basic things that are happening in the family. And I think that Barry Brazelton worked really hard with touch points to train medical personnel to talk about these things. And I find it really easy in a therapeutic setting, but only after I've gotten to know someone quite well. And 15 minutes for a doctor's visit, which is what most of the health insurance policies limit to, make it very hard for pediatricians. So one of the big things I'd like to suggest is seeing more social workers or counselors or emotionally adroit and accessible people there to kind of work with you, work that issue.
Sorry, I'm muted. And I appreciated your slide with a photo of the doctor who was, kind of looking at his computer. I think that's the reality. And so we've done that in Fresno. We had a training program for residents and one of the things we did, universal screening for depression and anxiety in a highly traumatized community. And what we found was we had huge rate, 45% of the people screened positive with a PHQ-9 of 10 or higher. We're going to find the same when we look for trauma. We know it already, but having those supports in place. So now we've screened everybody. What do we do? One of the challenges I'll speak to, and I'm looking back to some of my colleagues from public health, is our safety net system is really stressed right now for pediatric care, for obstetric care, just to get in, particularly for families with Medi-Cal or who are uninsured. And so so that's a real stress already. And then to, so for instance, the comprehensive perinatal services program, we don't really have a lot of providers. In Fresno, that was built around, we had social workers and other people in those obstetric clinics that had this comprehensive perinatal services program. We don't really have a lot of providers here, largely because we don't have a lot of, Medi-Cal isn't as big of a population. So one of the unique challenges of Placer County is that some of the basic kind of safety net services that other communities might have, we don't, including kind of those supports in our medical offices. So we need to figure out a new system to build that in.
What about therapeutic advisors or therapists in your community?
Yeah, so and particularly our community health clinics have a lot of those. We have federally qualified health centers, like, I don't know if we have any from Chapaday or WellSpace or say hi, or Western Sierra Medical Clinic. So a lot of those, in fact, even for obstetric care now, that's mainly where families with Medi-Cal, most of the Medi-Cal obstetric care is through those clinics. And so we're building on more and more of those types of supports there. The concern actually in the studies that we did in Fresno was women with commercial insurance had less access in some cases than the Medi-Cal population. So it's a challenge, and lots of, again, kind of multifaceted, complex, but it's a real challenge. Other thoughts?
Something that we have seen is we've had this huge increase in violence, and the level of violence, the level of trauma that families are coming to us with, and how many services that they need. Where in the past maybe we would have 100 people a year in our safe house, and each of those people needed about 50 services. When you look at, they need therapy 10 times, and they need a couple appointments with an advocate for legal assistance with a restraining order, or some crisis intervention and safety planning. But like last year alone, we had 329 people in our safe house. So it's more than tripled in just a couple of years. And the level of trauma, the things that have happened to people, it's insane. And how to increase our ability to meet those people at their needs, how to, because our funding hasn't tripled in 2 years, right? And so our safe house was built to accommodate about 100 people a year. And it was built 10 years ago, and it was fantastic. For 8 years, we always had an extra room or two in case law enforcement called and said, we need to get this victim and children in immediately. We always had a room ready to go, and we would say, yes, bring them in. Now we're at capacity all the time. And last year, we turned away over 500 people for our safe house. And so where we used to only need about 100 a year, last year we served 329 and turned away 500. So that's 8 times the need that we had in the past. So what we're going to have to work on now is we're going to be expanding our safe house. There's just no other option. We have staff who have to evaluate. We get this person calls and it's a mother with 2 children, and she was strangled last night and spent the night in the hospital. And here we have a single father with 3 kids, and he's been stabbed and needs to discharge from the hospital and doesn't know, where he's going to go because they haven't caught his perpetrator yet. And then, this other family where there was kicking and punching, and the kids were in the room when it happened, but we have 1 room. So who do we choose? And who do we turn away? And so the vicarious trauma that our staff are even feeling right now, having to decide who gets that safe room and who stays in the violence or lives in their car or, has to leave their job and family and everything and try and find some place on the run. So it's super, super difficult, and it's funding. I'm going to echo what Catherine said. It's funding. It's, we have a fundraiser this Saturday here, so come on out. But just having community supports. But I would say one fantastic thing we do have is great community partnerships. I'm glad that you called out Kids First and Lighthouse and the other groups that we have in our community who are serving, because we work so well together. And I see Barbara there, and I've talked to others earlier, and you guys are to Gary, and you guys are just fantastic. So. Good things going too.
Yeah, and law enforcement, as we press work harder at developing those trusting relationships and bonds with people in the community, we're getting much more efficient and much better at intervention and stepping into violent situations and really being able to gain partnership with people, especially victims of crime, because they're tending to trust us more. And I think that's causing the kind of issues we're seeing on Jenny's side of the house, where the overwhelming response now is both a product of us being successful on certain fronts. And so I would agree, we need funding, we need some policymakers to step up and start making some decisions in terms of support, because the need is clearly there. And if law enforcement continues to do our job and do it effectively, it's going to continue to overflow things as the ripple effect goes on down the line.
Yeah, thanks. There's these challenges. I know Lighthouse and Kids First have wait lists, and they're challenged with space and time and resources, and it's a challenge. The need's there. We know the need's there. Capacity needs to be built. As we think about this issue, you guys may be wondering, how can I get involved? And I'd like to ask our experts and think about, what is it? What are some specific ways that we can get involved with this issue? And so, Doug, we'll start with you, and then we'll kind of move down the line here, and it's our call to action.
Well, I'd say as a society, we're never prohibited from looking down the road and being able to determine what our future is going to be. Someone said, and I hope I get this right, that if you sow a thought, you reap an action. You sow an action, you reap a habit. You sow a habit, you reap a character, and you sow a character, you reap your destiny. And I think if we think collectively as a society and we apply that in a personified way, we move forward together in the right direction. So to know things and to be inspired by what we've seen and heard today is one thing, but if we do nothing with it, then we just become indifferent. So today, each of us are at a crossroads, really, of either choosing to be indifferent or choosing to take action. So think about where you're at. I know in law enforcement, we are really working much more specifically about collaboration, working together with people, staying in it with people for the long haul instead of just intervening and then leaving and drawing away and allowing the havoc just to churn on however nature would take its course. So we're refusing to allow that to continue on anymore, and we would request the same of you guys here today. With the needs being very obvious, think about what you can do. Think about how you can participate, the people that you know, the people you can reach out to and influence, whether it is policy, whether it is funding, and choose to take action.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I love the crossroads. And all of you have many connections. You know someone who you think right now, I wonder if this person I know, they seem passionate about this topic and I want to give them some information. I think the video we played earlier is already online somewhere, and you can share that. You can get the word out, tell people that trauma really affects not just, the adults who were having this traumatic event, but it affects the brain development of the fetus, of the very young child, how that's developing. And so get out there and make sure that people know about the problem. Write to your policymakers, because to my knowledge, VAWA still hasn't passed, which is just crazy to me that it's the Violence Against Women Act that actually is a misnomer, because it protects everyone who is a victim of a crime. And write to your senators and urge them to get this passed again. And then also, attend the fundraisers of these amazing nonprofits that are in the room. Find out when they are and attend and give, because they're doing fantastic work. I sort of jokingly said, but there is a flyer on our table for our big dance, Dancing with the Stars. It's this Saturday right here. We have a capital campaign that we're going to be starting soon in order to build that safe house. And in order to do that, we need 5 more board members. So if you know somebody who you think, oh, I bet this person I know would be really interested in that, have them contact us. I'm sure that, all the nonprofits in here are looking for volunteers. And so go and roll your sleeves up. I was talking to a gentleman out in the hall who was challenged by some of what we're doing and wanted to help, but wasn't sure, am I ready for this or that? So, he rolled his sleeves up and he's helping us every week at the thrift store, which I really, really appreciate. So there are a million ways that you can help. Just don't walk out of here and forget it.
So it's my turn to echo you. So in addition to everything that Doug and Jenny said, we in Placer have an amazing opportunity to build on our already promising practices. We have, the county has funded care for foster children, and we have trauma-informed care. We have generally very high quality childcare in Placer County. Placer County Office of Ed and First 5 Placer fund a full-time behavioral specialist who's available for childcare providers who can call and say, I don't know what to do, help me get resources. And so I think that we just need to continue to have these conversations. If you are working with children or you see children, tell your stories, because I think awareness is a big part of it. And Robin and I think Rob have echoed, this is across all income models. I cannot emphasize that enough. While our low income families have least access to resources, our higher income families are experiencing it too. So make it okay to have the conversation. If you see something, say something. And whether it's in your neighborhood, your community, and absolutely pay attention to what's happening in your children's school and childcare. And the younger the children are, volunteer, intervene. Everyone can do something.
Great. Yeah, I would certainly echo that, starting, both on the advocacy, but also the local action, and even starting with ourselves, recognizing that in this room, probably the data tells us that many, if not most of us, experienced and continue to experience trauma in our lives, but also to be informed by that, to talk, breaking down stigma for those of us who've gotten help, and to talk about that, and also in our families, talking about the challenges of parenting. And being open and honest about that, but then reaching out to others and helping other parents who are in need, and really supporting the families that are struggling in our communities, kind of at the individual level, and moving up to the policy level. You mentioned nurse-family partnership. We have really a modified version of that here in Placer County. Part of the reason is it's a really expensive model, and so getting to the funding issue, we do have lots of public health nurses and social workers involved in doing home visits, but not enough, and probably will never have enough. And so this idea of having a home visitation model, I know there's some like the family resource centers and Early Head Start are doing some of the home visitation without nurses, so having more peers doing that, kind of building a system where every family that needs support gets it, and having that level of support, but having kind of being strategic about it so that we have maybe referrals into our not everyone has to see a nurse in the home, but so that's one, maybe a call to action is, hey, let's get our heads together. That's something that we can do in the next year, so when we come together at this conference next year to see that we've made some progress towards really building a system where every family gets the support they need.
I would just add, are there judges? Are there any judges here in the audience? Court judges? My training is about looking at natural points of prevention. So of course, pediatric offices are really important, and you've heard these people have a lot of wonderful points of intervention, but prevention at the legal level among judges and legislators, as well as physicians, are critical. These are points where people naturally come, and you were talking about people that you were apprehending. I mean, it's been made a part of people's sentencing to become a part of the relief nursery in Oregon. That's a really good policy for anybody who has children to have to, it's a captive audience. And so as part of their sentencing, there is a time that they're committed to the Parenting Institute. And those points of intervention, you probably have as many ideas as I do, but engage those people all you can, the legislators, the legal profession, and it sounds like your criminal justice group is really has a foot in the door and is making real differences, listening to Doug.
And there's a different approach with prevention than there is for mitigation, right? And being aware of those differences and getting involved at different levels is important for our community. We've talked about that, and And also, Kids First, this next month is Child Abuse Awareness Month in April, and Kids First has a luncheon April 5th. Invite you out to that and come help and support that awareness effort, and we'd invite you to that luncheon. It's our 21st annual luncheon, and we're celebrating 30 years of Kids First in the community, so very excited about that. We're ready to move on to our Q&A session where you guys have texted in some items, and so we're going to go ahead and put that question up on the screen. I have it here, so I'll read it to you. I have a little heads up text message from Katie back there, so thank you. I'll go ahead and read it, and then you guys can take some time to think about how best to answer it. But Placer County has incredible resources and interventions available for our community. Yet, as a school-based practitioner, there are barriers in terms of knowing how to connect families with resources and interagency collaboration for prevention purposes. Here's the question. How can we do better with getting information into our schools, which are the #1 referral source for mental and behavioral health services? How can we do better with that?
Sure, and I think I probably know the least about this, but just as a parent, I just went to our oldest daughter is starting high school, and so we had the kind of orientation to high school and being a high school parent, and there was some talk about stress and don't take really hard classes all at once, and that. But I think educating families about the resource, because we do have some strong resources, and kind of having that as it just kind of brought into our normal orientation at different transition points might be one potential thing. I know we have, even our Placer County website, we're just revamping that right now, but trying to get all the resources in one place. It can be really complicated. We talk about the mental health system, it's fragmented, and a lot of that's by funding streams, and so trying to make that as simple as possible and putting all the resources at least in one place. So.
I know that the county is working on it. I mean, I don't think that there's a perfect answer because we need multiple people doing multiple things, and I think it's a fair question. I do know that the leadership at school districts and at Placer County Office of Education are at the table. They sit on smart policy. We have not yet figured out how to have a one-stop. We talked about this last night. We really do not have a one-stop place. Jenny was saying, well, if she needs childcare, they'll call me, and if they need other services, you call around. But I think that that's a fair question. I don't think we have a good answer, and I think that that's really one of maybe leadership's call to action is what are we going to do about that?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think disasters come in recipes, and so to fix disasters, it requires a multifaceted, multidisciplinary response. We've seen, I was just talking to one of our school resource officers, and this is further down, people who are in high school and junior high, but they're recounting the ability to interact and connect with kids at an incredible rate because they're just face-to-face contacts all day, every day, and the value of that in terms of detecting, intervening, and then developing the rapport to get that cooperation so that people can even, become a partner in the services that are offered is a critical step. So we're seeing that happen, but I would agree it requires a lot of people at the table, and I think we're doing well there. We're starting down that road, but always with more action required, and we can, and I'd love to see us do better down the road.
For us, we do have a large outreach team who are able to go out and a lot of advocates who we have the ability to respond immediately, and that's really fantastic. Some of it, sometimes it's dealing with policy differences and how do our policies affect a partnering policy, their policies, and how can we make sure that we're working well together and remember that the real core is this child who needs help and not the red tape that we have to try and get through in order to get that child services. Another thing that we're doing is we're working with the Strategy Center and First Five in order to map everywhere that violence is happening right now. And from that, what we're hoping to get is like, here are the red spots, and it's happening a ton in this area. And how do we get in there sooner so that it's not 10 years later that we're hearing about this 10-year-old that's struggling? It's immediately when there's this very young family who's still figuring things out. How can we intervene then? And then find the areas where it's not happening or it's not being reported and find out, okay, is it not happening or is it not being reported? If it's not being reported, how can we get them services earlier? If it's not happening, what are they doing well? What's happening in this community that's a protective factor? And how can we emulate that over here in this community where they need more of those protective factors? So it's this fantastic project that we're really super excited to be a part of. And to my knowledge, it's the first time anybody's done this at this level. And we're sort of bouncing off something that the First Five already had completed in mapping a lot of different factors in what would put a family at risk. And so we're sort of bouncing off of fantastic work that's already been done. And just the fact that we have a community where somebody else already did this amazing research project and they're willing to say, hey, add a layer to it. So we also know about domestic violence and sexual assault in our community as well. And so that's a fantastic partnership that could hopefully lead toward prevention.
Nathan, I will tell the person who specifically asked the question, start with the network of care and start there, and then that should be able to help you at least be able to figure out who to connect. Sometimes I think we assume that everyone knows about all the other services that are happening, and they don't, but the network of care is a great place to start. If not, contact your Family Resource Center, and they will help you find some resources.
That's a great suggestion. And Robin, you've had experience across the state, across the country. Have you seen successful ways to get information into schools, perhaps, that would be beneficial?
I think one of my favorite models is a system of community centers that were originally designed for athletics and for bringing people in for swimming and all kinds of classes. But they have incorporated everybody here, and the Children's Trust Fund or Child Abuse Prevention. They've incorporated all of that under one roof, and it's very helpful because people are coming there for fun, and they are able to outreach to varying people themselves in that setting in a non-stigmatizing way. And that's a very progressive model. Another model that really matters is if you can persuade the legislature of the importance of prevention. In Oregon, we took a percentage of the budget to create, of the remedial budget, to create a prevention model. And the grants, the Office of Prevention Services gave services throughout the 36 counties in Oregon, and they had to show standard good practice, and they had to show good data, but the money was funneled directly for preventive resources as a part of the remedial budget, existing remedial budget at that time. It's grown. The preventive services began to really make a difference in foster care and the stuff that's costing taxpayers oodles of money in every state. And as that money came into the communities, they found community resource centers, not family resource centers as such. They're not social services, but they're either using schools after hours for collective resources for families to come in. They again come in for fun ideas in the evening. They may come in for basketball. They may come in for meetings of some kind of class or other, but they assemble all of those resources. They have delegates from the varying community resources right there on site. Again, destigmatizing the whole idea of prevention. Those are two models that I know of.
Thank you. We have a second question. I'll read it if you can't see it. And the planning commissioner side of me is coming out with this one, but what plans do you have to expand mental health facilities here in Placer County? The not in my backyard, the NIMBY, is prevalent from city to city. How are you going to combat this to help the children and young adults? What do we have planned?
Well, I'll start. I think on the front lines, law enforcement traditionally gets called upon to deal with the very visible issue of mental health in terms of homelessness. We've recently made a compact, not only between various agencies in the county, but across county lines, where at times we see people moving problems, per se, where they'll take someone severely mentally ill, homeless, and just kind of take them across jurisdictional guidelines and drop them off. And so the problem tends to bump around. We have all agreed that that's not a fair way to start dealing with it, number one. Number two, the Roseville Police Department, and we're starting to see this movement permeate throughout various law enforcement agencies, established a social services unit where we have people dedicated selectively to confronting the issue of homelessness, getting people in touch with the services available, instead of just going out with an enforcement model only and trying to enforce the problem away. That isn't working. Can anyone raise their hand thinks that's working? That's not working. So we're starting to see the benefits of that. We're starting to see problem-oriented solutions coming about as we literally force ourselves to confront and try to solve the problem. And in addition to working with other agencies and groups, nonprofits, in partnership with what we're trying to do and accomplish.
Yeah, if I may first kind of just to challenge the premise. I agree with the question, I know where it's coming from, but challenge the premise that we necessarily need more facilities to like lock people up. I mean, if sometimes facilities kind of, we hospitalize at a higher rate here in Placer County for mental health than most of the other counties in our region. So although there, as we know, there are access problems for getting a psychiatric bed. We have 16 beds that the county runs. That's the only, I think the only, for primarily people with Medi-Cal. But for the private sector, there was actually an effort to get a private psychiatric facility very close to this location and failed due to the community kind of mobilizing against that effort. So the NIMBYism is certainly real about mental health services, and probably we could use some more inpatient beds, particularly for pediatric, right? For child and adolescent psychiatry, we don't have an inpatient unit here. But for sure, I think we have plans to continue to expand mental health services in general, looking at crisis stabilization unit services, maybe to keep people out of the hospital who are in a crisis. We already have a mobile crisis team, but expanding that, maybe including people experiencing challenges, a substance use crisis, and kind of using existing resources with a mobile mental health crisis team to also respond. I know we work a lot with law enforcement, kind of doing right along with like our homeless liaison team, et cetera. So I think there's a lot more we can do in expanding mental health services, and probably on the facilities side as well. But just building more facilities is probably only part of the answer.
For us, obviously, the facility, we need to expand our safe house. We can't turn away people who need it. And we have tripled our therapeutic staff in the last couple of years, and that has helped. I think sometimes one of our difficulties is like we have had a posting for a bilingual therapist for like 4 years with 0 applicants. So part of it is just trying to find the resources, the human capital who want to come and be part of this mission and then stick with it, because it can be difficult to face trauma and trauma all day long. And then we just hired an attorney last week. So for the first time ever, we have a family law attorney to help our clients with all of their legal stuff. So that's super fantastic. And so I think part of it is like stabilizing the rest of what's happening at home so that they can face the issues that they're having with their mental health. You know, they can't look at substance abuse before they know where they're sleeping tonight. So like knowing what needs to happen first so that they can find that peaceful place and be able to address their mental health issues.
Well, that's great. Thanks for addressing that. I think I'd like to do something and take 2 minutes. I'd like for you guys to introduce yourself to your neighbor there and share with each other one thing that you've taken away so far from the presentation and the panel, and we're going to come back and we're going to do some more questions. So take 2 minutes and interact with each other a little bit and share what you've learned. We're going to get started with another question. So go ahead and wrap up your thought, and we'll bring it back to the panel here. Thank you for your time today. Appreciate your efforts in trying to raise healthy children in Placer County. Not as effective as Jeff. Jeff, can you come up here and get their attention? Okay. Let's go ahead and take a look at this next question, and we can decide who can address it. But are there any underlying trends that you see as the reason for the increase in domestic violence? It's a great question. Any trends that you guys have experienced?
For us, what we have seen is just, it literally has been just like the last couple of years. I think that we see just across the board people pushing boundaries that they didn't used to push, or saying things that they didn't say in the past. Even friends and neighbors and families are fighting, politically or whatever. And so there's this sort of like underlying, like, for one, anger, for two, this permission to step beyond what they thought was reasonable before. And so, I mean, we're having victims who are forced to lay in a bathtub full of ice water overnight, who are like the kinds of things, I never saw that before. The perpetrators are being creative with how they will hurt and torture these victims, and what the kids are being exposed to. Like everybody in this room, you heard the rumble of just joyful talk, right? Everybody's excited about something right now. But if you heard a rumble just outside this door right now, it sounded like something super angry is happening, everyone in here would have this fight or flight, right? Like, do we run out this door? Do we face it and try and take it on? Do we, hide in the back? Or how do we handle that? And that's what our kids in this community who are being exposed to violence are getting, that constantly, and that trauma that just doesn't go away because it's home, it's where they live, or being pulled out of that home, which is, there's another trauma. So, what we're just seeing that people are willing to go that extra step, and also that people are tired of hearing about it. So people don't want to have these uncomfortable conversations, and if they hear their neighbors fighting, they'll close the shades and turn their TV up, and instead of having block parties and getting to know each other and offering to, hey, let me watch your kids for a couple hours on Friday so you guys can get out and have some time. But so I think that we have less community and more individualism, and just more anger.
Yeah, I'd echo that. We see that increasingly as technology increases. I was talking last night, mentioning that you walk into a restaurant, you see a family sitting there, and everyone's heads down, buried into their electronic devices. And the significant increase in technology has provided an environment where it produces a significant decrease in interpersonal communication and conversation. I think there's an issue with emotional intelligence. I think that we value cognitive intelligence, and that's a good thing, but we need to understand that being in touch with your emotions and being able to express them in a way that's productive is not a skill that even into adulthood people have. I value a lot what Robin was talking about, the need for learning empathy. When we go into these homes, these chaotic situations where at times we are literally pulling people physically apart, and then we start breaking it down as things calm down, the lack of empathy in many different directions is troubling. And so I think with emotional intelligence and anything we can do toward the end in intervention and teaching people how to productively express and work through problems. We all have relationships, and we gotta find ways of productively getting over hurt feelings and confronting hurt feelings and problems. And it's like a skill that was never learned, like the playing of a piano. So we're seeing maybe recurring themes from people who have grown into adulthood and have never learned those things. So programs in schools I think would be great. I think there have been some in history where emotional intelligence is brought up and actually taught as a curriculum. I think that would be beneficial, and I think we would see the benefits later on into adolescence and adulthood.
So on the prevention side, Placer County Office of Education is going into the schools with PBIS and MTSS, and districts are carrying things out. At the early childhood level, we are starting with very young preschool children, teaching them how to express their feelings and appropriately express their feelings. And we're also working with the parents because I don't know the why, but we have such an increase of CPS cases and very stressed parents coming in. They're very harried. They barely have time to have a conversation with their preschool or childcare teacher. And so I think, Doug, you've hit it on. Start early and intervene.
All great points, and I think one space to watch is around substance use. So kind of anecdotal information from our behavioral health providers that, wow, they're seeing a lot more kind of really violent behavior and related to substances, including things that we haven't seen before, kind of crazy bath salts and new substances, but also methamphetamine, which has been around for a long time. But, and Doug could probably speak more to this, seems to be kind of an increase in some of our communities in the use of methamphetamine and other substances.
Yeah, I'll just touch on that very quickly. Drug abuse across the board, we've seen a huge insurgence in methamphetamine, but additionally, the abuse of prescription drugs. And what ends up happening is consequently the people who get and start abusing some of the prescription drugs, especially synthetic opiates and painkillers, they balance it out with things like methamphetamine. And so back when they created the indestructible pill as some of the prescription drugs were being abused, kids were chopping up some of the prescription drugs and overdosing as a result of eliminating the time release factor in some of those pills. So the pharmacies and the creators of these pills created indestructible pill where you couldn't do that. That blew open the market. We saw heroin pour into our area, and consequently a lot of the crime that results in some of that stuff. And that just begins to lay a horrible foundation for people not being able to be social. And so antisocial behavior is really a predicate to a lot of violent behavior. So we're hoping that through some preventative measures and some things we're seeing, that dealing with substance abuse, I think, would start seeing an increase in or a decrease in our efforts in domestic violence.
I think, Doug, there is a real connection in the things that you said. That is, there's a huge connection between the expression, the adequate expression of strong emotion and substance abuse. I really believe that people who are abusing substances, including alcohol, are after a feeling of valuing, a feeling of filling something empty inside. And if we can ever get to the place, as Catherine talks about from the very beginning, where we teach that it's not stuff that fills that, it's something else. It's relationship, it's being valued, it's it's working hard and meeting challenges, but it's expressing positive emotion, expressing negative emotion in a pro-social way, has everything to do with the opioid crisis. And I do think that the materialism of our current culture is giving the feeling to people that if they just have stuff, that will somehow, we've seen so many stars get all of that cycle going where they get all kinds of stuff and then they kill themselves. And, we need to be giving the message of how to fill that void with love and what that is about. It's not about what you give, it's not about what you get, it is about what you give. And it's from that reaction, that relationship, that you are able to fill that empty place. We don't teach it very well. And I didn't say it very well, but you get what I mean.
Yeah, and sometimes you get the thought or question about, is it actually increasing, or are we identifying more instances that already existed? And with child abuse and neglect and issues with raising healthy children, is that growing, or are we able to identify more, or is it a combination? What are you guys' thoughts with that?
What we're seeing is definitely both. because a couple of years ago we also changed our outreach format. So we very exponentially increased our outreach, and so more people know who we are. People have heard of Stand Up Placer, where a couple of years ago maybe they hadn't. So there's increased awareness, and our community partners are working really closely, so they are referring. And so there's definitely this piece of people know we're here now, so they know how to access services. But the level of trauma, the level of violence, we always would have gotten a lot of these referrals because law enforcement has always referred every domestic violence case. When they come across a domestic violence case, one of the first things they do is call our crisis line, and it's called Domestic Violence Emergency Response Team. We are reactive. And so those cases would have come to us either way. But what we're seeing is the level of violence and the amount of trauma that they've experienced is just exponentially worse. So it's both, I think. And then also in the last 6 months, we became pet friendly in our safe house. And that has helped because for the first time, people who had pets who thought they could not leave their abuser because their pet would be injured or killed are now able to bring their pets with them. And that has, I'm sure, caused an increase as well.
Well, thank you. We have another question that I think is really good, and I think it's real. And let's take a look at this and see how we can address this. I'm curious as to your guys' perspective, but this explains some of the problems I've seen with a really bad little kid in my neighborhood. And what can I do, though? It's not my kid. And as we think about this as a community, it is going to take healthy families to get involved to address this issue, and it's not just other people's problems. And so what can we do, legally? What can we do, practically in a loving way? How can we address this?
I'll start. I'm often asked how many children I have, and my answer, as you heard last night, is 27,000, because that's how many kids we have, birth of 5 in Placer County. And so these are all our children, but everything, we can't have influence without having a relationship. And earlier with your call to action, so you just said, do you know your neighbors, right? It's not like, oh, what are you doing to your child? But hey, how you doing? How's it going? Hi. Just starting that relationship, because then you can begin to have influence and this empathy for other children, and just not judging the behaviors like the folks who are judging my child who's been homeless most of her 4 years. But the teachers, when they understand, when they've had trauma-informed care, our PCO teachers have been phenomenal, and then they're able to have empathy. And then it's not like, oh, she's just doing that to get my attention, which is, of course, a child's job to get our attention, but they're doing it because they're reacting and responding to it's their brains that have been, as Robin talked about. And so this empathy and relationships and just getting to know the folk before you try to have influence.
Yes, I could not agree more. I think that I found it fascinating because I've worked in law enforcement long enough to where I still remember driving around neighborhoods in the middle of the day after school and seeing a ton of kids out playing, interacting, playing with one another. I drive around now, it's like a ghost town. I think, is there vacation? Is, what's going on? And I think most kids are either inside or, off doing various different activities. And there's very little interaction anymore as a culture between neighbors. I came from a part of the country where my backyard didn't have fences, and you'd go out in your backyard and you could look down 2-3 houses and see Billy was out there, and running around all over the neighborhood with one another. Parents would commonly interact, and it wasn't uncommon. So I think with distance, there's a lot more judgment. And I think if we start advancing a culture, the way we interact just in our neighborhoods, where we start talking to people more often. It is not uncommon in law enforcement that one neighbor is just tired of the neighbor right next to him. The way our houses are. They're right there. Oh, he's too loud. He's this, he's that. Well, have you gone and talked to him? No. What are you talking about? Talk to him? I bake a plate of cookies, walk over there, say, howdy, neighbor, how you doing? And strike up a conversation. And you might, like Catherine said, you develop a relationship, a rapport, and then you can start solving problems and even be more empathetic maybe to what's causing the problem. So,
yeah, I would just, maybe what I might do, and first, I'm not suggesting the person who submitted this question, but I don't really believe there's such thing as bad kids. I'm sure I kind of get a sense of what the behaviors might be that, and so in reaching out to the parent, and again, as a parent myself and having children that sometimes don't always behave in ways that align with our expectations, is to have some empathy, having a conversation, maybe starting with something not around the kid's behavior and bond with the parent in some other way, but then to identify and find kind of common ground about, sometimes my kids, you might see them out doing some bad things too, and let me know and we'll try to address that, but try to build the bridge as opposed to just, judging. It can be hard.
We're wrapping it up here, and I just want to add some. Okay, we have. So was that our last question, Katie? Yeah. Okay. So we're going to take a moment and move to our closing session here, and to think about. We can all give our time, talent, and treasures. Those are things that we can do in our call to action, and think about what we can do to help address this issue. It's a tough issue. It's complicated. It takes a lot of people in a community to come together and address raising healthy children in a community. And it really is a hard thing. While we can give our time, talent, and treasures, this is something at the heart of what we believe is important, and we need to emphasize that heart and priority within our community so that we win the children and make them healthy, so they can grow up healthy here. Just in response to the last question, initially when you see a child that's behaving inappropriately or a situation, often our first reaction is to pull away or to withdraw or to judge, even make a judgment and say something's wrong there. I think we need to flip that a little bit and think, how can we embrace and accept and welcome those situations within our community? And really what it comes down to in the heart is, Kisirin Ingira is a phrase that the mighty Maasai tribe in Africa use, and even young warriors on the battlefield will walk by each other and say that phrase to each other, Kisirin Ingira. And this phrase is, when translated to English, is, how are the children? And people that have no children at all greet each other in this way, because the Maasai understand the importance of raising healthy children for a healthy community. And it's their highest priority that they greet each other in that way every time they see each other. And they understand that it's everyone's responsibility. And that's what we're doing here today. We're asking, how are the children? I wonder if our politicians and other folks often ask that in their meetings, if we might have some different results. But let's make an emphasis to do that, because everyone deserves to feel loved and that they belong in Placer County, everyone. And so as we wrap this up, I want to make a point of inviting you guys to not just leave, but please spend some time out at the booths and figure out how you can actually sign up and get involved with a call to action. We need each other in this community. And there's a book signing, and we're so thankful, certainly for the presentations here. I'd like to thank Jeff and Todd for your opening statements. Can we give a thank you to the panel here and everyone that's involved? I'd like to specifically thank Robin Carr Morris for her expertise and wealth of knowledge and bringing that to Placer County to figure out how we can continue to grow as a community. And so will you just give a wonderful thank you again to Karen? And then lastly, you owe yourselves a big thank you. Obviously, you're taking time out of your day and time, and you're here engaging in this topic. And so we're very thankful that you're here participating in this. This is important to us. And so obviously a huge thank you to you. and let's continue to put a large priority as a community coming around to raising healthy children in Placer County. That's it for today. Thank you.